The letter was sitting in my mailbox like a ticking time bomb. I knew before I even opened it that it was from the HOA. The thick, official-looking envelope had that self-important air about it, the kind that screamed, "We're about to make your life miserable." I tore it open right there on my porch. Violation notice, it read. Excessive holiday decorations. Fine. $10,000. I let out a dry laugh. They can't be serious. I glanced at my modest display, just a few strings of lights on the roofline, a glowing reindeer in the yard, and a wreath on the door. It was festive, sure, but excessive? Not even close. Then I noticed the signature at the bottom of the letter. Harriet Thompson, HOA president. Of course. Harriet had been on a power trip since the day she was elected, enforcing ridiculous rules while conveniently ignoring the ones that didn't suit her. I folded the letter and walked inside, already knowing exactly how this was going to play out. See, what Harriet didn't realize was that I wasn't just some clueless homeowner she could push around. I was Benedict Trask, the lawyer who had written the very bylaws she was attempting to use against me. And she had just made a massive mistake. I stood in my living room, turning the letter over in my hands. The sheer audacity of Harriet Thompson never failed to amaze me. I had seen her pull stunts before, but this was a new level of overreach. A $10,000 fine for holiday decorations? It was laughable. But Harriet wasn't laughing. She thought she had me trapped. She thought I would cower, write a check, and fall in line like so many other homeowners she had steamrolled over the years. She was in for a rude awakening. I walked over to my desk and pulled out a thick binder. It was the HOA's official rulebook, the very document I had written years ago when the association was first formed. Back then, the goal had been simple: to maintain property values and create a fair system where everyone could enjoy their neighborhood without interference. But under Harriet's reign, the HOA had become something else entirely, a tool for control, a way for her to exert dominance over the community. I flipped through the bylaws until I found what I was looking for. There it was, in black and white. Holiday decorations were allowed from November 15th to January 10th, with reasonable displays consistent with community standards. Nowhere did it define excessive, and certainly nowhere did it grant the HOA the authority to impose arbitrary fines without due process. Harriet had overplayed her hand. I spent the next hour drafting my response, citing every clause she had ignored, every rule she had violated. I informed her that her fine was unenforceable and that if she pursued it, she would be in direct violation of the HOA's own governing documents. I also reminded her politely, of course, that arbitrary fines issued without due process could be considered fraud. By the time I sealed the envelope, I was feeling satisfied. But I knew Harriet. She wouldn't back down quietly. And I was right. The next morning, I heard a knock at my door. When I opened it, Harriet was standing there, flanked by two members of the HOA board, Marlene and Richard, her usual enforcers. Harriet held my response letter in one hand, her expression a mask of forced politeness. She wasted no time. She informed me that my appeal had been reviewed and denied. The fine stood, and if I failed to pay it within 30 days, the HOA would place a lien on my property. I let her finish, then calmly pointed out that her so-called review process was non-existent. No hearing had been scheduled, no neutral party had been consulted, and no official vote had been taken. Furthermore, I reminded her that placing an illegal lien could open the HOA up to a lawsuit for damages. Richard shifted uncomfortably, but Harriet didn't flinch. She simply informed me that the decision was final and turned to leave. I wasn't about to let her walk away that easily. Before she could step off my porch, I casually mentioned that I had already drafted a complaint to the state's housing authority. Harriet froze. Then I told her that I had also prepared a lawsuit for wrongful fines and abuse of HOA power, which I would be filing if this nonsense didn't stop immediately. I saw the first flicker of doubt cross her face. I wasn't bluffing and she knew it. I leaned in slightly and reminded her that as the person who had written the HOA's bylaws, I knew them better than anyone. I knew exactly how far her authority extended and, more importantly, where it didn't. I watched as Harriet's confidence wavered. Richard cleared his throat, looking increasingly uncomfortable, while Marlene avoided eye contact altogether. Then, without another word, Harriet turned and walked away. I knew this wasn't over. Harriet wasn't the type to admit defeat. But the game had changed, and I was just getting started. As Harriet and her lackeys retreated down my driveway, I shut the door with a quiet certainty. This wasn't over. Harriet had too much of her fragile pride tied up in her position to simply let this go. She would regroup, strategize, and come at me from another angle. That was fine. I had dealt with far worse than a power-hungry HOA president with a flimsy grasp of legal procedure. I settled into my office chair and opened my laptop. If Harriet wanted to escalate, I would be ready. I drafted a formal complaint to the state's housing authority, outlining the HOA's blatant disregard for its own rules. To bolster my claim, I compiled a document detailing every instance of Harriet's overreach, unfair fines, arbitrary rule enforcement, and the suspicious way she had steamrolled her way into power. I had seen too many cases where HOA leadership used their positions for personal gain, and Harriet fit that mold perfectly. The real question was whether anyone else in the neighborhood had been targeted the same way. If I could find others who had suffered under Harriet's so-called leadership, I could strengthen my case. I sent a few discreet messages to neighbors I trusted, asking if they had ever received questionable fines or enforcement actions. By the time I closed my laptop, I had a plan. Harriet had tried to play me, but she had made a crucial mistake. She had underestimated just how much I enjoyed dismantling bad-faith legal maneuvers. The next morning, I received my first response. Greg, a retired firefighter who lived a few houses down, called me. He sounded irritated but unsurprised when I explained what had happened. He had his own run-ins with Harriet, most notably when she tried to fine him for parking his work truck in his own driveway, despite the fact that the HOA's own rules allowed it. He had paid the fine just to avoid the hassle, but now that he knew she had no legal standing, he was more than happy to share his story. That was just the start. Over the next 2 days, I heard from half a dozen residents with similar experiences. Harriet had fined a young couple for having a small vegetable garden, despite no rule prohibiting it. She had forced an elderly widow to remove her bird feeder under the pretense that it attracted dangerous wildlife. She had even threatened to tow a disabled veteran's vehicle from his own driveway, claiming it was an eyesore. The pattern was clear. Harriet wasn't enforcing the rules, she was making them up as she went. Armed with this information, I drafted a letter to the entire neighborhood. I kept it professional but clear. I outlined the illegality of Harriet's actions, explained residents' rights under the HOA bylaws, and encouraged anyone who had been unfairly fined to challenge it. I attached copies of the relevant sections of the bylaws for easy reference, ensuring that no one could claim ignorance of the rules. Then, I delivered a copy to every single house. By the end of the day, the neighborhood was buzzing. People were furious not just about the fines, but about the realization that they had been manipulated for years. Harriet had relied on fear and misinformation to maintain control, assuming that no one would question her authority. That illusion was gone. I knew it wouldn't take long for word to reach Harriet. Sure enough, that evening, I spotted her pacing outside her house, talking animatedly on her phone. She glanced in my direction more than once, her expression darkening with each passing moment. I didn't need to hear the conversation to know what was happening. The board members who had once supported her were realizing that she had led them straight into legal liability. Residents were beginning to push back, questioning fines they had blindly accepted in the past. Harriet's entire foundation of control was crumbling. The next HOA meeting was scheduled for the following week. I had a feeling it was going to be an interesting one. When the day arrived, the clubhouse was packed. Usually, HOA meetings were dull affairs attended by a handful of residents, but tonight was different. People had come prepared, clutching copies of my letter, copies of their unwarranted fines, and in some cases, outright demands for refunds. Harriet sat at the front of the room, flanked by the rest of the board. She looked composed, but I could see the tension in her posture. She knew this was a reckoning. The meeting opened with the usual formalities, but it didn't take long before the real issue surfaced. Greg stood up first, his voice steady as he recounted how Harriet had fined him for his work truck. The young couple with the vegetable garden spoke next, followed by the elderly widow and the disabled veteran. One after another, residents stood and shared their experiences, the frustration in the room growing with each testimony. Harriet tried to maintain control, insisting that all fines had been issued in accordance with HOA policies. That was my cue. I rose from my seat, holding up the HOA's own bylaws. The room fell silent as I calmly explained how Harriet had overstepped her authority time and time again. I pointed to the sections she had ignored, the due process she had failed to follow, and the legal consequences of her actions. Then, I delivered the final blow, a formal motion for a vote of no confidence in Harriet's leadership. The room erupted in murmurs. Harriet's face turned red as she tried to interject, but the tide had turned against her. Residents who had once been too intimidated to speak out were now nodding in agreement. Even some of the board members looked uncertain. The vote was called. One by one, hands went up. When the count was finished, Harriet had lost. She tried to argue, insisting that the vote was illegitimate, but the bylaws were clear. A majority vote of no confidence meant she was removed from her position effective immediately. For the first time since I had received that ridiculous fine, I saw true panic in Harriet's eyes. She had built her power on the assumption that no one would challenge her. Now, stripped of her authority, she was just another homeowner, one who had made a lot of enemies. As the meeting adjourned, residents began discussing next steps: refunds for unfair fines, audits of the HOA's finances, and most importantly, electing new leadership that actually followed the rules. Harriet stormed out without another word. I watched her go, then turned to Greg and the others. The HOA wasn't perfect, no HOA ever was, but for the first time in years, real change was possible. And it had all started with one ridiculous fine. The night after the meeting, the neighborhood felt different. Conversations outside homes stretched longer than usual. People who had never spoken beyond polite nods were now exchanging stories, and there was an undeniable sense of relief hanging in the air. It was as if Harriet's removal had lifted a weight off everyone's shoulders. But I knew better than to assume this was the end. There was still work to do, and Harriet wasn't the type to go down without a last attempt at retaliation. The first sign of trouble came the following morning. As I stepped outside to grab my newspaper, I noticed a black SUV idling at the end of my driveway. The tinted windows made it impossible to see who was inside, but the way it lingered there before slowly rolling away sent a clear message. Someone was watching. I wasn't intimidated. If anything, it confirmed that Harriet was still trying to play the game, even after being voted out. The question was how she planned to make her next move. I didn't have to wait long for an answer. By the afternoon, a notice had been posted on the community bulletin board near the clubhouse. It was a formal challenge to the results of the HOA meeting, signed by none other than Harriet herself. According to her, the vote was illegitimate because it hadn't been scheduled in advance with proper notice. She claimed that without a sanctioned election process, she was still the rightful president. It was a pathetic attempt to cling to power, but I had to give her credit for persistence. Unfortunately for her, I had anticipated a move like this. Before she could start rallying whatever support she had left, I called for an emergency board meeting. Since Harriet had been removed, the board was now operating in an interim capacity until an official election could be held, and that meant they had the authority to uphold or dismiss her challenge. The meeting was held in the clubhouse, the same place where Harriet had been voted out. This time, the atmosphere was even more charged. Residents who had been quiet before were now openly discussing their frustrations, and the board members who had once hesitated to challenge Harriet were looking far more confident. Harriet arrived late, walking in with an air of forced confidence. She carried a folder tucked under her arm, likely filled with whatever argument she had concocted to justify her challenge. As she took a seat at the front of the room, I noticed the way she avoided eye contact with the very people who had voted her out. The meeting started with the board reviewing Harriet's claim. She argued that the bylaws required a minimum 72-hour notice before a vote of no confidence could be called. She insisted that because this hadn't been followed, the results were null and void. It was a weak argument, and I knew exactly how to dismantle it. I calmly pointed out that while the bylaws did require advance notice for most votes, there was a specific clause allowing for immediate removal in cases where the board determined that an officer had acted outside the scope of their authority. Harriet had done exactly that by issuing illegal fines and threatening liens she had no power to enforce. The room was silent as I laid out the case against her, citing each bylaw violation in meticulous detail. Harriet's face remained composed, but I could see her fingers tightening around the armrest of her chair. She knew she was losing this battle. When the board finally voted on her challenge, the result was unanimous. Her appeal was denied, and her removal was upheld. Harriet was officially out, with no path to reclaiming her position. As the meeting adjourned, she stood abruptly and walked toward the exit without a word. But I wasn't fooled. She wasn't done fighting. Later that evening, I received a call from Greg. His voice was tense as he explained that Harriet had been seen speaking with a local attorney known for representing HOAs in disputes. If she was planning to take legal action, she would need a lawyer willing to argue her case, and it seemed she had found one. I wasn't particularly worried. The law was on our side, and Harriet had no real grounds for a lawsuit. But I also knew that a prolonged legal battle could create chaos for the neighborhood, and that was likely her goal. If she couldn't win, she would try to make things as difficult as possible before she was forced to accept defeat. I decided to get ahead of her. The next morning, I filed a preemptive motion with the local housing authority, requesting an official review of the HOA's recent actions. By bringing in an external regulatory body, I ensured that any legal challenge Harriet attempted would have to go through proper channels, making it much harder for her to manipulate the situation. A few days later, Harriet's lawyer sent a formal letter to the board, threatening to sue for wrongful removal. He claimed that Harriet had been unfairly targeted and that she had every intention of taking the matter to court if she wasn't reinstated immediately. The board forwarded the letter to me, and after reviewing it, I knew exactly how to respond. I drafted a reply citing the bylaws once again, reiterating the legal basis for Harriet's removal and making it clear that any lawsuit would be met with a countersuit for damages caused by her abuse of power. The lawyer must have realized Harriet had no case, because within 48 hours, he withdrew his threat. That should have been the end of it. But Harriet wasn't done. A week later, I woke up to find my holiday decorations vandalized. The lights had been ripped down, the glowing reindeer toppled over, and my wreath was nowhere to be found. It was a petty, desperate act, and I had no doubt about who was behind it. Fortunately, I had anticipated something like this and had installed security cameras after my initial run-in with the HOA. I reviewed the footage and, sure enough, there she was, Harriet, sneaking onto my property in the middle of the night, her face barely concealed beneath a hood. I wasted no time. I took the footage straight to the police and filed a report for trespassing and vandalism. Within a day, officers showed up at Harriet's door. She tried to deny it, but the evidence was irrefutable. The charges weren't severe, but the damage to her reputation was irreparable. The woman who had once ruled the HOA with an iron fist was now being exposed as a petty criminal. The neighborhood, which had once feared her, now openly mocked her. With nowhere left to turn, Harriet finally did what she should have done from the beginning. She packed up and moved out. The HOA, now under new leadership, quickly began undoing the damage she had done. Illegitimate fines were refunded, Fair policies were reinstated, and for the first time in years, the community felt like a place people actually wanted to live. As for me, I kept my holiday decorations up a little longer that year. Not out of defiance, but as a quiet reminder that standing up to corruption was always worth it. With Harriet gone, the HOA had a chance to rebuild itself from the ground up. The board, now operating without the iron grip of their former dictator, was eager to regain the trust of the community. While some members had been complicit in her actions, most had simply been too afraid to challenge her. Now they had no choice but to face the consequences of enabling her abuse of power. The first order of business was a complete audit of the HOA's finances. Given Harriet's track record, I suspected there was more to uncover than just unfair fines and arbitrary rule enforcement. If she had wielded her authority so recklessly, who was to say she hadn't been mismanaging funds as well? I wasn't the only one with that suspicion. As the board settled into its new leadership, Greg and a few other residents pushed for full transparency. The community had been paying dues for years, but no one actually knew where all that money had gone. Sure, there were landscaping costs, maintenance fees, and occasional clubhouse repairs, but the numbers never quite added up. The new treasurer, a meticulous accountant named Dana, took the lead on the investigation. Within days, she started uncovering discrepancies. There were records of payments to contractors that no one had ever seen working in the neighborhood, invoices for repairs on non-existent damages, and most damning of all, several large withdrawals from the HOA's account that were labeled as administrative expenses but had no corresponding paper trail. It didn't take long to figure out that Harriet had likely been embezzling funds. The board held an emergency meeting, this time without any fear of retaliation. Residents packed into the clubhouse, eager to hear the details. Dana laid out the evidence, showing exactly how Harriet had funneled money out of the HOA's accounts under the guise of routine expenses. She had been careful, spreading the theft out over years so that no single withdrawal raised suspicion. But when viewed as a whole, the pattern was undeniable. The room buzzed with outrage. It was one thing to abuse power through fines and arbitrary rules, but outright theft was another level entirely. People demanded action. I advised the board to file a formal complaint with law enforcement. Embezzlement was a serious crime, and Harriet needed to be held accountable. Some residents worried that pursuing legal action would drag the neighborhood into more drama, but the majority agreed that ignoring it would set a dangerous precedent. If they let Harriet get away with it, what was stopping the next HOA president from doing the same? Within a week, the police had enough evidence to open an official investigation. Harriet, who had barely finished moving out, was suddenly facing criminal charges. She had assumed that leaving the neighborhood would shield her from the fallout, but she had underestimated just how determined people were to make sure she faced consequences. As the case against Harriet moved forward, the HOA underwent a complete overhaul. Policies were rewritten to ensure that no single person could wield unchecked power again. Financial audits became a mandatory annual procedure, and residents were given more direct oversight on how their dues were spent. With the toxic leadership gone, the neighborhood began to thrive in ways it hadn't before. People who had once kept to themselves out of fear of HOA retaliation now felt comfortable engaging with their neighbors. Community events, long neglected under Harriet's reign, were revived. The first major gathering was a holiday block party, a direct response to Harriet's ridiculous attempts to police decorations. Greg and a few others went all out, setting up an entire light show synchronized to music. A few houses even put up inflatable snowmen wearing judges' robes, an inside joke that brought plenty of laughs. The atmosphere was different, lighter, freer. I stood on my porch, watching the festivities unfold. The battle had been long, but it had been worth it. Harriet had tried to control the community through fear, but in the end, all she had done was unite everyone against her. As I sipped my coffee, Dana walked up, a satisfied look on her face. She had just received word that Harriet had been formally charged with fraud and misappropriation of funds. It would take time for the case to go through the legal system, but the important part was that justice was being served. For the first time in years, the HOA was functioning the way it was meant to, not as a tool for control, but as a resource for the community. And all it had taken was one ridiculous fine to reveal just how deep the corruption ran. The weeks after Harriet's downfall saw the neighborhood transform in ways no one had expected. The HOA, once a source of frustration and dread, was now being rebuilt into something functional. The new leadership worked to correct the damage Harriet had inflicted, and for the first time in years, residents felt like they had a say in how their community was run. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. Despite the sense of victory, I remained cautious. Harriet might have been out of power, but I knew better than to assume she was finished stirring up trouble. She had spent years ruling through intimidation, and people like that didn't just disappear quietly. That assumption proved correct when I received a letter from her lawyer. Unlike her previous threats, this one wasn't directed at the HOA, it was aimed at me personally. Harriet was accusing me of defamation, claiming that my actions had caused her irreparable damage both professionally and socially. The letter demanded that I issue a formal apology and pay an undisclosed sum in damages. I read through the document carefully, taking note of the vague language and flimsy legal footing. It was a last-ditch effort, a desperate attempt to regain some semblance of control. The irony was almost laughable. After years of abusing her authority, she now wanted to play the victim. I wasn't about to let her rewrite history. Instead of responding directly, I forwarded the letter to my own attorney, a longtime friend who had handled more than his fair share of frivolous lawsuits. His response was immediate and to the point. Harriet had no case. Everything I had said was backed by documented evidence, and her own actions had been the cause of her downfall. If she wanted to take this to court, she would only be digging herself into a deeper hole. I let my attorney draft a response, rejecting her claims outright and warning that any further harassment would result in a countersuit. I had no interest in dragging this out, but I also wasn't going to let her intimidate me into silence. Days passed with no word. Then, one evening, I noticed a moving truck parked in front of Harriet's house. A few workers were hauling boxes while Harriet stood on the porch, her expression unreadable. I watched as she gave a few last instructions before stepping inside. By morning, she was gone. The news spread quickly. Some saw it as the final confirmation that Harriet had truly lost, while others were just relieved to see her go. The HOA held another meeting shortly after, officially appointing new board members and finalizing the reforms that had been set in motion. With Harriet out of the picture, the last remnants of her influence were finally being scrubbed away. As I walked home that night, I took in the sight of the neighborhood. The holiday lights still glowed warmly, untouched by arbitrary fines or threats. People were outside, chatting with neighbors, no longer afraid of what ridiculous rule might be enforced next. For the first time in a long time, it felt like a place worth living in. I had always believed that standing up to corruption was worth the effort, but seeing the tangible results made it even more satisfying. Harriet had thought she could control the community through fear, but in the end, all she had done was unite everyone against her. As I stepped onto my porch, I noticed something hanging on my door, a small wreath, identical to the one Harriet had torn down weeks ago. Attached was a note, and signed but simple in its message. "Thanks for fighting back." I smiled, stepping inside. The battle was over, and this time, the right side had won.